The wheelchair hit the marble floor at 9:47 p.m. The sound traveled across the entire lobby like a gunshot. Everyone heard it. Nobody moved. 46 people stood frozen inside the Westbridge Hotel, businessmen, tourists, bellhops, a bartender mid-pour, and not one of them took a single step forward. One man did. He wasn't a cop. He wasn't security. He wasn't big, loud, or impressive-looking. Was a tired single dad in a worn jacket, holding his 6-year-old daughter's hand. And the deputy who'd just shoved a grieving disabled woman to the ground had absolutely no idea what he'd just activated. If you're new here, subscribe right now. Hit that bell. The stories we tell on this channel are the ones nobody else dares to tell, and this one goes places you won't see coming. Drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Let's go. Portland in November has a particular kind of darkness that has nothing to do with the hour. It isn't just the cloud cover that rolls in off the Pacific and parks itself over the city, like something that forgot to leave. It isn't the rain, though the rain is constant and personal, the kind that finds the gap between your collar and your neck, no matter how you angle yourself against it. It's something in the light itself. The way the street lamps turn everything amber and tired. The way the puddles on Burnside reflect headlights back up at you in long, watery streaks, like the city is slowly dissolving from the bottom up. Mason Rourke had learned, over the 3 years since he'd moved back here, to stop fighting it. He walked with his head slightly down, not from defeat, but from habit, a posture trained into him during 18 months of pre-deployment preparation that he'd never fully unwound. Shoulders relaxed, chin neutral, eyes moving. You learn in certain environments that the man who looks the most relaxed is often the most dangerous, and the opposite is equally true. The man telegraphing threat is usually the one you don't need to worry about. He'd stopped thinking in those terms. Mostly. His daughter Ellie walked beside him, her small hand wrapped around 2 of his fingers, not his whole hand, just 2 fingers, the way she'd done since she was 4 years old, and decided that was the appropriate level of grip for a girl who was... She had informed him, very seriously, basically 6 already. She was wearing her yellow rain jacket with the broken zipper he kept meaning to replace. Her dark hair was damp at the edges from the half-block sprint they'd made from the parking garage. She was carrying her own backpack, pink, covered in iron-on patches of planets and cartoon dinosaurs, and she was telling him something about a girl in her class named Priya, who had apparently done something at recess that was either very impressive or very rude, depending on which part of the story Ellie was currently narrating. Mason was listening. He always listened, even when part of his brain was doing other things. The Westbridge Hotel's revolving door exhaled warm air as they pushed through it, and the lobby opened up around them like the inside of a snow globe. Marble floors, vaulted ceilings, the distant suggestion of piano music from the bar somewhere to the left, and the low collective murmur of people who had paid significant money to be warm and comfortable on a November evening in Oregon. Mason had been here twice before, once for a work meeting back when he still had the kind of job that held work meetings in hotel lobbies, and once when Ellie had asked if they could go somewhere fancy for her birthday dinner. Westbridge wasn't the kind of place Mason naturally gravitated toward. Too much open space, too many sightlines, too many people he didn't know. Old habits, he steered them toward the elevator bank, scanning the lobby the way he always scanned rooms anxiously. Not obviously, just the quiet inventory that had become as automatic as breathing. The check-in desk, 2 staff members, 1 guest with luggage, straight seating area, cluster of business people with drinks, an older couple near the window, a hallway leading toward the restaurant, a bellhop with a cart, and he stopped the inventory. Near the elevator bank, seated in a manual wheelchair with a small overnight bag balanced across her lap, was a young woman. Late 20s, dark circles beneath her eyes that no amount of sleep was going to fix, not for a while. She was wearing a black dress that read as recently purchased, the kind of thing you buy in a hurry when you're not prepared for a funeral and don't own anything appropriate. There was a single white flower pinned to the lapel of a gray cardigan she'd layered over it. The flower was slightly wilted. She wasn't crying. She looked like she was finished with crying, at least for tonight. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that settles on a face after grief has wrung everything out of it. No, and she wore it the way some people wear their best clothes, carefully, because they don't have anything better and they know it. Mason looked away. Not his business. Ellie's story about Priya had reached some kind of crucial turning point involving a tetherball and a contested boundary line, and Mason was recalibrating his level of engagement when he heard the voice. It was the kind of voice that fills space without permission. Deputy Derek Vance was, by any observable measure, a man who had spent considerable energy constructing a version of himself that commanded respect and had mistaken that construction for the real thing. He was broad through the shoulders in the way that comes from dedicated gym time rather than labor. His uniform was pressed to a crease that suggested either obsessive attention or someone else doing his laundry. He wore his badge the way some men wear expensive watches, slightly angled outward, always visible, a reminder of status directed at anyone in the vicinity. He was off duty. He wasn't supposed to be there in any official capacity. But Derek Vance had a particular relationship. With his badge, he carried it the way a man carries a weapon. He doesn't entirely know how to use, confidently, carelessly, complete blindness to what it actually meant in the hands of someone like him. Mason heard his voice before he located him. What I'm telling you is that someone matching your description. The woman in the wheelchair, Claire Donovan, looked up at the deputy with an expression that suggested she had already explained something twice and was now calculating whether a third explanation would accomplish anything. I've already told you, she said. Her voice was controlled, but there was a tremor underneath it, not fear, Mason thought. More like the effort of maintaining composure when you have nothing left. I checked in an hour ago. My name is on the reservation. I'm not sure what else I can tell you. Derek shifted his weight. The movement was territorial, chest forward, shoulders square, positioning himself so that his body partially blocked her path to the elevator. I'm just trying to get some information. If you don't have anything to hide, this shouldn't be a problem. I'm not hiding anything. I've been at my mother's funeral. I'd like to go to my room. Something shifted in Derek's expression. It wasn't quite contempt. It was something more specific than that. It was the expression of a man who has interpreted the refusal to be cooperative as a personal challenge. You're going to need to watch your tone. I'm not. Claire stopped. Breathe. Started again. Sir, I'm asking you politely. Please let me through.
I'm not stopping you from going anywhere.
He gestured in a way that technically cleared her path, but made it obvious that clearing it was conditional on his continued goodwill. I'm having a conversation. I don't want to have a conversation. I want to go to my room. The lobby murmur continued around them. A few heads had turned the way. Heads turn when something is slightly off, but not yet clearly wrong. The kind of situation where people lean toward each other and say, "Is that?" before deciding they're probably misreading it. Mason had stopped walking. Ellie was still talking about Priya. He squeezed her shoulder gently, enough to pause as her. Hold on a second, Elle. She looked up at him, then followed his gaze. What's happening? I don't know yet, he said. Stay here a second. What happened next took approximately 4 seconds. Derek reached out, not a grab exactly, more of a directive motion, the kind of physical punctuation that men who are used to being obeyed use when words stop working, and caught the handle of Claire's wheelchair. She pulled back. He pulled forward. She said something sharp. Mason couldn't hear the words over the lobby noise, but the tone was clear. And Derek, who had managed to mistake her composure for weakness and her grief for vulnerability and her polite refusal for an insult, yanked. The wheelchair overturned. It happened faster than it had any right to. One moment Claire Donovan was sitting in it. The next she was on the marble floor, the chair clattering against the stone with a metallic shriek that cut through every conversation in the lobby like a blade. Her bag skidded 3 feet. The white flower came loose from her cardigan and spun slowly, coming to interest under one of the velvet lobby chairs. 46 people heard it. Nobody moved. Mason was already moving. He didn't make a decision. Exactly. That wasn't how it worked, and hadn't been since Coronado. Decision-making in a crisis is for people who have time to deliberate. What happens when you've spent years training your body to respond before your conscious mind finishes processing is something closer to physics than thought, stimulus, response, threshold crossed. The threshold had been crossed. He stepped toward Ellie, First, not to go to her, but to position her. One smooth movement that put his hand on her shoulder and guided her 2 steps backward until her back was near the reception desk. "Stay," he said quietly. "Don't move. I'll be right there." Ellie looked at her father's face and went still. She was 6 years old, and she understood something about his expression in that moment that she would not be able to articulate for many years, but would never forget. Then Mason turned and walked toward the deputy. He walked unhurriedly. That was the thing people would remember afterward, the ones who watched it happen, and later talked about it in the elevator or over drinks in the hotel bar. Not that he ran. Not that he shouted. He walked across 40 feet of marble floor with his hands at his sides and his shoulders loose and his face completely unreadable, and somehow that was more alarming than any of the alternatives. 2 hotel employees were already moving toward Claire, pulling her chair upright, beginning the process of helping her back into it. A guest near the window had pulled out a phone. Mason clocked all of this in the peripheral inventory that ran constantly, automatically, like a background program he couldn't fully shut down. Derek saw him coming and drew himself up. "Sir, I'm going to need you to—" "What happened?" Simple question. Flat tone. Mason stopped about 6 feet away, close enough to be a presence, far enough not to be a physical threat. Exactly the distance his instructors had called command range during the low-key hostage and civil confrontation training that most people didn't think SEALs did because they'd watched too many movies. "This is none of your concern. This is an official. She's on the floor." Mason tilted his head fractionally toward where the hotel staff were helping Claire back into her chair. "I saw what happened." Derek's jaw tightened. His eyes moved to Mason's worn jacket, the backpack still slung over one shoulder, the general impression of someone who'd driven here in a used car and was probably going to ask about parking validation. "You need to take your kid and go back to your table, buddy." Buddy. There it was. The diminutive. The social lever that men like Derek use as a pressure release when they want to establish hierarchy without technically saying anything inappropriate. Pal, chief, friend. Friendly words deployed as dominance. "Her name is Claire Donovan," Mason said. "She's checked in here. She just came from her mother's funeral. And you put her on the floor." Derek took a step forward. "I'm a law enforcement officer, and I'm telling you to remove yourself from— You're off duty." Mason's eyes dropped briefly to Derek's civilian clothes. The same assessment Derek had just run on him, reversed. "And you grabbed her chair." "I'm going to say this one more time." Derek's voice had dropped something low and deliberate, the register men use when they're running out of patience and want you to know it. "Take your kid and go." Silence for 3 seconds. Mason said, "Don't touch her again." The lobby around them had developed that particular stillness that precedes either violence or its interruption, the held breath quality of a room full of people who have collectively decided to wait and see before committing to any course of action. Derek laughed. The laugh was short and manufactured and not quite convincing. "You think you can tell me what to do? You know what happens to people who obstruct officers. You're not on duty." Mason's voice hadn't changed. Same tone. Same pace. Like they were discussing something mundane. "You're in a hotel lobby in civilian clothes. Whatever you're doing right now, it isn't official." Derek stepped closer. Now he was inside that command distance, which is exactly what he wanted, the personal space collapse, that was supposed to communicate, that he wasn't afraid, that he was willing to escalate, that the man in the worn jacket should be feeling the social pressure of that proximity. Mason didn't move, didn't adjust his posture, didn't blink more than normal. And Derek, who was used to that kind of approach, producing at least a small backward flinch, found himself looking at a man who simply wasn't responding to the input the way people were supposed to. Something behind his eyes recalibrated. "You're making a serious mistake," Derek said. "Maybe," Mason said, "but she's back in her chair now, and I'm going to stand here until you leave." From across the lobby, at the edge of his peripheral vision, Mason could see Ellie. She hadn't moved from the spot by the reception desk. She was watching her father with those wide, dark eyes that always saw more than he was comfortable with, and her hands were clasped in front of her, and she wasn't crying or panicking. She was watching to see what her father did next. That, in the end, was the only calculation that actually mattered. The hotel manager appeared young, clearly thrown, standing a careful 2 yards back in the way that people do when they suspect they might need to make a 911 call and want some running room. The guests who'd been pretending not to look were no longer pretending. A man by the bar had his phone up. Derek felt the surveillance before he saw it, that particular room, when the social dynamics have tilted and you realize you're the one being watched now rather than the one doing the watching. It's an uncomfortable sensation for a man who has relied on the implicit authority of a badge to control how rooms perceive him. He looked around once, slow, taking inventory the same way Mason had been taking inventory, except Derek's inventory was producing different conclusions. He looked back at Mason. "You just put yourself in my crosshairs," Derek said, low enough that only Mason could hear it. "You and your kid, I want you to understand that." Mason said nothing. He held eye contact and waited. Derek waited too. Some negotiation happened in the silence between them, not the kind that produces an agreement, but the kind that establishes what will happen next. Then Derek straightened his jacket, ran a hand once across his hair, and walked toward the lobby exit. His stride was controlled and deliberate, the walk of a man performing the exit he wants people to remember, rather than the exit he's actually making. At the door he stopped, turned halfway, looked directly at Mason, and smiled. Then he was gone. Mason stood still for another 3 seconds after the door closed. Old habit: never assume a tactical withdrawal is a retreat until you've confirmed it. He let out a slow breath and turned toward Claire. She was back in her wheelchair. One of the hotel staff, a young woman, probably early 20s, still visibly shaken, was crouched beside her, asking if she needed a doctor. Claire was waving the offer away with the specific firmness of someone who has had to wave away assistance many times and has gotten efficient at it. She looked up as Mason approached. Her eyes were dry. Her hands, he noticed, were trembling slightly in her lap, the adrenaline aftermath, the body processing what the mind had already decided to file away. "You okay?" he asked. She looked at him for a moment. Then she almost laughed, not quite, but almost. The kind of almost law that happens when something is so inadequate to the moment that it becomes accidentally funny. "Mother died on Tuesday," she said. "So, relatively. I'm sorry," he said. And he meant it the way people mean it when they've lost someone themselves and the words still don't fit. She studied him. "You didn't have to do that. I know. Most people in that lobby knew exactly what was happening and decided they had something else to look at." He didn't say anything to that. She was right, and they both knew it, and adding words to it would have made it smaller. "Thank you," she said finally. "Really," he nodded, picked up the small overnight bag that had slid across the floor and handed it to her. Started to turn back toward Ellie. "What's your name?" Claire asked. He glanced back. "Mason, Claire." She extended her hand with a kind of formality that seemed more like reflex than intention, the gesture of a woman who has learned to establish herself in rooms where people are inclined to look past her. He shook it. Her grip was firm. "Get some rest," he said. "You've had a long week." She looked at him with an expression that said something complicated about strangers and luck and the specific strangeness of receiving help from someone you'll never see again. And then she turned toward the elevator, and Mason turned back toward his daughter. Ellie was exactly where he'd left her. She looked up at him with those eyes. He crouched down so they were level. "Is she okay?" Ellie asked. "She's going to be." Who was that man? The big one who left. Mason considered how to answer that. It was a question with a long answer and a short answer. And this was a 6-year-old who'd been watching her father's face for the last 10 minutes and deserved honesty inside an age-appropriate container. Someone who thought he could do whatever he wanted because of what he wears on his shirt, Mason said. Ellie processed this with the particular seriousness of a child who is genuinely thinking something through rather than performing thought for adult approval. "But he doesn't," she said. "Get to do whatever he wants." Mason said. "He doesn't." She considered this for another moment. "You weren't scared of him." "I didn't say that." She gave him a look. 6 years old, and already she had the specific expression of someone who has caught a grown adult being less than truthful. "Okay," he said. "Maybe a little. Doesn't mean you don't do something anyway." She seemed to accept this. She took his hand, 2 fingers, the way she always did, and they walked toward the elevator. The lobby had resumed its ambient murmur. The bartender went back to pouring. The business people reconstructed their interrupted conversations. The guest with the phone put it away. Everything went back to the way it had been, except the man who'd smiled at Mason on his way out the door. That smile had landed somewhere in Mason's processing and not left. He'd seen smiles like that before, in Mosul, in Kandahar, in a safe house debriefing 3 days before an operation that had almost killed 4 of his teammates. It wasn't the smile of someone who'd accepted a setback. It was the smile of someone who'd decided to reschedule. He held the elevator door for an elderly couple, answered Ellie's question about whether they could order room service, and kept his face neutral and his voice calm the entire time. Inside, something he'd spent 3 years trying to quiet had opened one eye. 3 days later, Mason hadn't stopped thinking about the smile. He'd told himself that was irrational. He'd told himself that Derek Vance was a mid-level bureaucratic bully who'd been embarrassed in a hotel lobby and would move on to easier targets. He told himself a lot of things. Yes, the cum, in the particular way that people tell themselves things when they're not quite sure they believe them. He'd taken Ellie to school Monday morning, picked her up Monday afternoon, cooked the pasta she liked with the butter and the specific ravicchio and the specific ratio of parmesan he'd once written on a post-it note and stuck to the refrigerator because she wanted to make sure he understood what she meant by enough cheese. Gone to the search and rescue, volunteer training. On Tuesday, he'd been consulting with them informally for 2 months. He'd intervened, showing them things you couldn't find in a textbook, and driven home through the amber Portland streetlights, and thought about the smile 3 more times. Wednesday, he called an old teammate, not about Derek, just to talk, the way they did every few weeks. 2 men who'd served together, and now lived civilian lives on opposite sides of a country that would never fully understand what they'd done in it. "You sound like you're on Overwatch," his teammate said, about 20 minutes into the call. "You've answered every question. I've asked about 2 seconds. Too slow. That's your Overwatch voice. What are you watching?" "I'm fine, Mason." He didn't say anything. "What your problem is?" his teammate said, unkindly. "You took all that training and you decided you were done with it. Like it was a thing you could put in storage." "I am done with it." "Sure," his teammate said. "Absolutely. How's the girl?" "She's good. She's great. How'd she sleep last night?" "Fine. How'd you sleep last night?" Silence. "That's what I thought," his teammate said. "Take care of yourself, man." He hung up. Mason sat in his kitchen for a while after. The pasta pot was still on the stove. Ellie's artwork from the week covered the lower half of the refrigerator, 11 drawings of horses, 3 of which she'd given names to and expected him to remember. He looked at the drawings for a long time. Then his phone buzzed. It was a text from a number he didn't recognize. "See you around, buddy." Name, no context. The kind of text that is perfectly ambiguous until it isn't. And Mason had enough experience with people who operated in the space between threat and plausible deniability to know exactly what it meant. He put the phone down on the counter, picked it up again, looked at the message one more time. His first thought was Ellie. His second thought, arriving half a second later with the cold, specific clarity that always showed up when his training overrode his civilian life, was Thursday. Come Thursday, the West Bridge. Same location men like Derek always return to where they think they've been insulted. He'll want the home field. He stared at the message. He thought about not going. Thought about avoiding the West Bridge for a month. Taking Ellie somewhere else for dinner on Thursday.
Yeah.
Waiting for Derek's bruised ego to find a different outlet. He thought about what his daughter would see if he did that. He put the phone back down. Went to check that Ellie was still asleep. She was on her side, one arm wrapped around the stuffed rabbit she refused to admit. She still needed at 6 years old, her dark hair splayed across the pillow, breathing slow and even. He stood in the doorway for a while. Thursday, he thought again. He wasn't wrong. Thursday came the way Masons knew it would, gray, wet, and inevitable. He'd spent the 2 days between the text message and Thursday doing what he always did when his mind refused to settle. He worked with his hands. Replaced the broken zipper on Ellie's yellow rain jacket. Fixed the cabinet hinge in the kitchen that had been loose for 6 weeks. Drove out to the search and rescue training facility on the east side and spent 4 hours helping a group of volunteers practice grid search patterns in a field that had been sectioned off with orange flags. He showed them how to walk a line without drifting, how to use a rope team across uncertain terrain, how to read a topography map when GPS wasn't cooperating. He didn't tell them where he'd learned any of it. They didn't ask, which suited him fine. Wednesday night, he sat at the kitchen table after Ellie was in bed and read the anonymous text message 11 more times. He was trying to determine whether it was genuinely from Derek or from someone with a wrong number who used the word buddy as naturally as most people use hello. He ran the probability in his head, the way he'd once been taught to run threat assessments, not paranoia, but structured evaluation. Behavior pattern, known target profile, known capability, motive. Every column pointed the same direction. He put the phone face down on the table. He thought about calling the non-emergency police line, reporting a potential harassment situation, providing the text as evidence, following the civilian protocol he'd been living by for 3 years, the protocol that said, you let institutions handle institutional problems and you don't insert yourself into things that aren't your fight. He thought about Claire Donovan on the marble floor. He thought about 46 people who'd found something else to look at. He thought about Ellie's face in the doorway of the lobby, watching. He didn't call the police line. What he did instead, sometime around 11 p.m., was go to the closet in his bedroom and take down a small lockbox from the high shelf. He sat on the edge of the bed, with it in his lap, for a few minutes, without opening it. Then he put it back where it had been, went to bed, and didn't sleep well, which he'd expected. Thursday morning, he made Ellie oatmeal with the brown sugar she liked, and packed her backpack and drove her to school. She chattered about a science project the entire drive, something involving a model of the solar system, and whether it was fair that Pluto wasn't a planet anymore, and her strong personal opinion that the scientist who made that decision owed Pluto some kind of apology. What do you think, Dad? Doesn't that seem unfair? I think Pluto's fine with it, he said. You don't know that. She looked at him with withering 6-year-old certainty. You're not Pluto. He pulled up to the school drop-off line, and she climbed out and ran toward her classroom without looking back, which was a developmental achievement he was simultaneously proud of and still adjusting to. He sat in the drop-off line for a moment after she disappeared through the doors. Then he drove back toward the West Bridge. He didn't go inside. Yet. He parked across the street in a loading zone and sat with the engine off, watching the entrance the way he'd once watched compounds from elevated positions in places he was no longer permitted to talk about in detail. With binoculars. Not with any equipment at all. Just eyes and time, and the particular patience that certain kinds of training produces the ability to watch something for a long time without your attention degrading into restlessness. The Westbridge Hotel occupied the corner of 2 streets in the central business district. The main entrance faced west, a revolving door flanked by 2 sets of pull-doors and a covered awning that kept the constant Portland drizzle off guests while they waited for their rides. The side entrance, which Mason had noticed on his first visit 3 years ago, without conscious deciding to notice it, was on the north face of the building, a service doors that was frequently propped open during afternoon hours when catering deliveries came through. The parking structure was attached at the south end. 3 camera positions visible from the exterior, 1 above the main entrance, 1 covering the drop-off zone, 1 on the parking structure facing the street. He estimated at least 4 interior cameras in the lobby itself, based on placement conventions for buildings of this class. He wasn't planning anything. He was just looking. That was what he told himself. At 10:40 in the morning, Derek Vance pulled up in a silver pickup truck and parked in a 15-minute loading zone directly in front of the hotel. He sat in the truck for a while. Mason couldn't see his face from this distance, just the shape of him behind the glass, the way his head moved as he looked at his phone. After 12 minutes, Derek got out of the truck. He was in civilian clothes, dark jeans, a gray jacket that probably cost more than it looked like it should, badge visible, though Mason couldn't rule it out. He walked into the West Bridge, through the main entrance, with the particular stride of a man who owns whatever room he's about to enter. Mason stayed across the street. He was running 2 simultaneous assessments, and he knew it, the tactical one, which was cataloging Derek's behavior and drawing conclusions from it, and the emotional one, which was telling him to go home, that this was not his problem, that he had a daughter in a classroom right now the solar system, building a model of the solar system, and she needed who came home in one piece with no new complications. The tactical assessment was winning, which worried him slightly. He was in the lobby of the West Bridge by 10:58. The morning lobby was a different creature than the evening one, where the night lobby was all amber light and murmured adult conversation. The morning version ran on coffee and rolling luggage and the specific aggressive efficiency of business travelers who had somewhere to be and were already mentally calculating whether they'd make it. The staff moved faster. The piano was silent. The bar was serving pastries instead of cocktails, and the general atmospheric register was productive rather than comfortable. Mason ordered a coffee from the lobby cafe, a small counter near the north wall that he hadn't noticed during previous visits, and took a seat that gave him the elevator, bank, the main entrance, and the hallway leading toward the business center in his field of view simultaneously. He put his phone on the table and opened a navigation app he wasn't actually using. He waited. He thought about what his SEAL instructor, a dry, compact chief petty officer from West Virginia, who had approximately zero patience for what he called narrative thinking, had once told him during pre-deployment briefings. The biggest mistake you can make in a dynamic environment is deciding what's going to happen before it happens. To write the script, you only get to read it fast. Mason had been writing a script all week. He knew it. Derek shows up, makes a move. Mason intercepts. Clean, comprehensible, solvable. Real situations were never clean or comprehensible. They were loud and ambiguous, and happened faster than you're planning, and usually involved a detail you hadn't anticipated. He was on his second cup of coffee when Claire Donovan came out of the elevator. She'd changed from the funeral dress. She was in dark pants and a burgundy sweater now, her wheelchair moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been using one long enough that it had become an extension of her body rather than an object she operated. She had a tote bag over one shoulder and ball in her lap, and she was looking at her phone while she navigated toward the hotel's business center hallway with the focus of someone who had a schedule and intended to keep it. Mason almost said something, almost lifted his hand. Then he thought about what that would look like a man she'd met once, appearing in the same hotel lobby 3 days later, telling her he'd come because he'd received a vaguely threatening text message he couldn't prove was about her at all, and he kept his hand down. She rolled past the cafe without looking his direction. He turned back to his phone. 30 seconds later, Derek Vance came in through the main entrance. He didn't look toward the cafe. His eyes went straight to the elevator bank, and when they found it empty, they moved in a slow sweep of the lobby that was so practiced, it looked natural. He was doing exactly what Mason was doing, which told Mason something specific about Derek that he filed away, without deciding what to do with it yet. Derek's eyes stopped moving. Mason followed the line of his gaze. Claire had paused near the business center, hallway shifting the folder in her lap. Derek started walking. Mason put down his coffee. He moved at an angle that would bring him into the hallway ahead of Derek, without cutting directly across his path. It was the kind of spatial maneuvering that looked accidental, unless you knew what you were watching for the trained habit of positioning without telegraphing. He made it to the hallway entrance first. The hallway was quieter than the lobby, carpeted, lined with meeting room doors, and a small alcove with a business center terminal. Claire was at the end of it, near the business center door, pulling a key card from her tote bag. Derek came in behind Mason and stopped. For a moment, the three of them formed a strange geometry in the hallway, Derek at the entrance, Mason 6 feet in from it, Claire at the far end, none of them looking at each other yet. Claire turned and saw Derek, and the way her body responded to it told Mason everything about what that sight meant to her. It wasn't a flinch, she was too controlled for that. But there was a micro-contraction across her shoulders, a slight shift in how she was holding the key card, the involuntary preparation of a person who has learned to break. Derek smiled. Ms. Donovan. What a coincidence. Her voice came out steady. What are you doing here? Staying here, actually. He pulled a key card of his own from his jacket pocket and held it up briefly, a performance for both audiences. Booked a room. 2 nights. Great hotel. He looked around at the hallway with the appreciative expression of a tourist and then looked back at her. You put in a complaint against me. I did. Want to know something interesting about that? She said, simply, without elaboration. The department's reviewing it. They do that. He took a step forward casually, in the way that casual is sometimes weaponized. They review it, and they talk to witnesses, and they look at what they can substantiate. And you know what's interesting? Most complaints against officers don't substantiate, especially when the complainant has an attitude problem. I didn't have an attitude problem. You knocked me out of my wheelchair. You became agitated during an official inquiry, and your chair tipped. He tilted his head. Accidents happen. Nobody's fault. There's surveillance footage, she said. Something moved behind his eyes. Just briefly, a recalibration, the kind that happens when a piece of information arrives that you'd assessed as unlikely. Hotel footage gets reviewed by the hotel, he said. Exactly objective. Mason had been standing in the hallway this entire time without saying anything. Derek hadn't acknowledged his presence, which was interesting. Either he hadn't registered him as the same man from Monday, or he hadn't was choosing not to open that front yet. She doesn't want to talk to you, Mason said. Derek turned. And this time, recognition landed on his face, not the wide-eyed kind, but the slow, deliberate kind of a man who had already processed the possibility and was now confirming it. Derek said, "Look at that." She said, "No. That means you leave." Derek looked at Mason with an expression that was almost pleasant, the way the surface of water is pleasant when you can't see the depth. "You again," he said. "The buddy from Monday," Mason said. "Mason." Derek crossed his arms. Relaxed posture, which Mason noted an uncrossed arm defensive position, indicates genuine tension. The crossed arm casual is sometimes the opposite, a person so confident they're not bothering to maintain ready posture. "What you did the other night? You interfered in a lawful police activity. You weren't on duty. I'm always representing the department. That's not how it works. You a lawyer? No. Then maybe you don't know how it works." Mason held his ground without moving toward him. This was the part of the confrontation that most people misread. They thought the goal was to establish physical dominance. It wasn't. The goal was to establish that you weren't going to be moved by pressure, which is a different thing entirely, and it required not moving rather than advancing. "I'm going to ask you once to leave this hallway," Mason said. Once, Derek repeated. He sounded amused. "Or what? Or we find out what happens next." Silence. Then Derek laughed. The laugh from Monday, short, manufactured, not quite convincing, but something changed in the architecture of his amusement. The edges of it were harder. "You're an interesting guy, Mason." He uncrossed his arms. "I've been doing this a long time. You know what I've learned about guys like you? You step in. You make your point. And then when the thing gets real, when it's not just a hotel lobby with witnesses around, you find out what you're actually made of." He shrugged. "Most people aren't made of much." "Most people," Mason agreed. Silence. Derek waited for something for Mason to fill it, to qualify the statement, to blink. Mason didn't do any of those things. Derek looked back at Claire. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, reasonable, sounding in the way that threat sometimes disguises itself as reason. "You should think about whether this is worth the energy, Ms. Donovan. The complaint's going to go nowhere. You already know that. People like you." He paused on those two words just long enough for them to mean what he intended them to mean. "File complaints. They get reviewed. And then everyone moves on. People like me," Claire said. "People who make things into bigger deals than they are." She looked at him for a long moment. Her hands, which had been gripping the key card, went still. "I came back to this hotel," she said, "because I'm not going to spend the rest of my life avoiding places where someone decided I didn't matter. And I filed that complaint because what you did was wrong. I'm going to keep doing both of those things, no matter what you say in this hallway." Derek stared at her. Then he looked at Mason. Mason didn't say anything. There was nothing to add. Derek's jaw moved. He was deciding something. Mason could see the callousing running across his face, the way weather moves across an open sky. Then he reached some conclusion, and the calculations stopped. "Enjoy your hotel," he said to Claire. And then to Mason, "Enjoy your coffee." He turned and walked back into the lobby. Mason watched him go. He counted 5 seconds after Derek disappeared from the hallway entrance before he moved anything. Claire let out a breath that had probably been held for 2 minutes. "How long were you sitting out there?" she asked. "A while." She looked at him. "You knew he'd be here." It wasn't quite a question. "I suspected," he said. which was true and also slightly less than the full truth. She studied him with the careful attention of someone who has spent a long time learning to read people's intentions quickly, because the cost of misreading them was high. "Who are you?" she asked. "I told you, Mason. That's your name." "That's not what I asked." He thought about how to answer. He'd gotten good at the deflection, the modest shrug, the just try to do the right thing that people seem to accept, and that required him to say nothing real. He'd used it so often, it had become its own kind of truth, a performance of humility that let him avoid explaining things he didn't want to explain. "Buddy important," he said. She looked at him the way Ellie looked at him when he said something she didn't believe. Nobody important showed up at this hotel twice in 3 days because he thought a woman he'd met once might be in trouble, she said. That's a very specific kind of nobody. He didn't have an answer for that, which was unusual for him. "You should make sure you're visible," he said, shifting. "Stay in areas with cameras. Don't go anywhere in this building alone until—" He stopped. "If the complaint's under review, it means someone in the department is paying attention. He's smart enough to know that. He won't—" He recalibrated again because he was making predictions, and he'd just reminded himself this morning not to do that. "Just be visible. You're worried he'll escalate. I'm saying it's possible." She's nodded. Slowly, she was processing something, running some internal calculation of her own. "The footage," she said, "from Monday. I asked the hotel manager about it yesterday. He said there are multiple angles." "Good," Mason said. He said, "If I want it preserved as evidence, I need to make the formal request through the right channel." He gave me a form. She held up the folder in her lap. "That's what I'm here for. The business center has a printer." He looked at the folder, then at her. "You came back here," he said. "He might be here." "I told you why," she said. "I'm not going to spend my life." "I know what you said." "I'm saying that takes something." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. It wasn't quite gratitude, and it wasn't quite annoyance, and it sat in the complicated space between them. "Everyone has something," she said. "They just don't always know what it is until they need it." He thought about the lockbox on the high shelf of his closet, about the weight of it in his lap. "Yeah," he said. They sat in the lobby for an hour after that, because either of them had planned to. Mason had moved back to his cafe table. He'd print a pull when Claire came out of the business center with her printed forms, and she'd rolled past him and then stopped, and looked at the chair across from him and said, "Is that available?" He'd pulled it out. She'd set her folder on the table. They'd talked in the way that people talk when they've been through something together, that neither of them has the vocabulary for in circles, at first, approaching and retreating from the real subject, covering safer ground first. He learned that she'd grown up in Eugene, had studied communications at Oregon State, and was working remotely for a nonprofit that developed accessibility resources for public institutions. The disability was from a car accident 4 years ago, cervical spine injury, incomplete, meaning she had partial function in her lower extremities, but not enough for reliable walking. She'd spent 14 months in rehab, and she'd told the story of those months in the clipped, efficient way people tell stories they've told many times and no longer need to perform for. She'd come to Portland for the funeral. Her mother had died of a stroke. They hadn't been close in recent years, and that complicated the grief in the particular way that complicated things always complicate grief. You aren't just mourning the person. You're mourning the version of things that was never going to happen now. She told him that without quite planning to, he thought. The words came out in the middle of something else she was saying, and she paused briefly after them, as though surprised they'd left her. "I'm sorry," he said. Same as Monday, and meant it the same way. She asked him about Ellie. He told her more than he'd intended. That was the other thing about Claire Donovan, that he hadn't anticipated and was now recalibrating. Around, she listened the way people listen when they're genuinely interested, not when they're waiting for their turn. It made it harder to be brief. He told her about the pasta with the post-it note and the correct ratio of Parmesan. He told her about the solar system project and the Pluto debate. He told her that Ellie's mother had died when Ellie was 3, a cerebral hemorrhage that happened on a Tuesday afternoon and was over before he'd gotten the call, and that he'd been in the middle of a completely ordinary Wednesday when the world rearranged itself permanently. He didn't tell her about the seals. He wasn't sure why. It wasn't shame. He'd moved past most of the complications that came with that particular past. It was more that mentioning it changed how people listened to the rest of what it became the lens they looked at everything else through, and he'd grown tired of being seen through a single lens. At some point during the conversation, Derek came through the lobby. Not approaching them, he walked from the elevator bank toward the main entrance, moving with purpose, not looking left or right. He passed within 20 feet of their table, without appearing to register them. Mason tracked him to the door without changing his expression or his posture. Derek pushed through the revolving door and disappeared. Claire had been watching Mason watch Derek. "You didn't even tense up," she said. "I did," he said. "You just didn't see it." She held his gaze. "What did you do before this? Before Portland?" The question landed in the space between them and sat there. He drank the rest of his coffee, which had gone cold. "Things that took me a long time to figure out how to leave behind," he said finally. She waited to see if more was coming. When it didn't, she accepted it the way she'd accepted a lot of things in the past 4 years, not with resignation exactly, with the particular grace of someone who understands that people's borders exist for reasons and doesn't need to push against them to feel respected. "Okay," she said. They talked for another 20 minutes about things that didn't matter as much. A book she was reading. A trail near Mount Hood that someone had told him was good for slow hikes with a 6-year-old. The way Portland's weather seemed personally motivated, like it had decided to be difficult and was committed to the bit. So when she said she needed to get to a meeting, he stood when she moved toward the elevator, not the performative courtesy, just the reflex, and she said goodbye, without the formal handshake this time. Just a direct look, and something that was almost a smile, the specific expression of a person who's decided, provisionally, to trust something they haven't fully verified yet. He watched her get on the elevator. Then he went back to his table, picked up his cold coffee, and looked at the lobby with the same quiet inventory he'd run on arrival. Derek's truck was still in the loading zone across the street. Mason could see it through the tall lobby windows. The silver pickup, rain-dimpled, parked where it had been all morning. Derek had walked out through the main entrance, but his truck was still out there, which meant he hadn't actually left. Mason set the coffee down. He pulled out his phone and looked at the anonymous text message again. "No. See you around, buddy." Then he looked at the elevator Claire had just stepped into. He was already standing up when the hotel fire alarm began to scream. The alarm didn't wail the way hotel fire alarms usually do, that half-hearted pulse that everyone ignores because it's always a kitchen malfunction or someone's cigarette in a non-smoking room. This one hit full volume immediately, the kind of sustained shriek that bypasses the rational part of the brain and goes straight to the part that controls legs. The lobby fractured. Guests came off the elevator in clusters, some with luggage, some without, all of them doing the rapid environmental scan of people who don't know whether this is real. Staff moved toward their stations with the slightly too deliberate calm of people following a protocol they'd rehearsed but never used. Bartender at the lobby cafe was already reaching for his radio. Mason was moving before the second pulse of the alarm finished. Toward the exit, toward the elevator. He hit the call button and watched the display. Claire's elevator had gone up. He'd clocked the floor number before the alarm started. 4th floor. He hit the button again, pointlessly, the reflex of a man who knows the action won't speed anything up, but does it anyway because standing still isn't an option his nervous system will accept right now. A hotel staff member, young, female, the same one who'd helped Claire on Monday, appeared at his elbow. "Sir, we need everyone to move toward the emergency exits. There's a woman on the 4th floor in a wheelchair," Mason said. "The elevators are going to lock out. Who do you have going up the stairs?" She blinked, but the question was specific and competent in a way she hadn't prepared for. "Security, is they're doing a sweep, stairwell B or stairwell A?" "B, I think." The east side he was already moving. The stairwell door was 20 feet from the elevator bank, marked with a green exit sign that someone had allowed to go so slightly dim. Mason noticed this automatically, the same way he'd noticed the loose cabinet hinge, at home, without judgment, just filing it. He pushed through and took the stairs 2 at a time, which in his worn jacket and civilian shoes felt different than it had felt in boots and kit, but not as different as he sometimes liked to pretend. First landing. Second. His breathing adjusted the way it always adjusted, Not the labored recalibration of someone working harder than expected, but the smooth, automatic gear shift of a system that had been tuned to this specific demand for years. Was aware of the sound of the alarm filtering through the stairwell walls, aware of voices from the floors above, aware of his own footfall on the concrete, all of it arriving in parallel streams that he'd processed simultaneously without losing primary focus. Fourth floor door. He pushed through into a carpeted hallway where the alarm was louder, a strobing white emergency light at the far end, casting everything in uneven pulses. Claire was 30 feet down the hall. She'd made it out of her room, or she'd been in the hallway, when the wasn't sure which. She was moving toward the stairwell, at the far end, the west stairwell, pushing her wheelchair with the focused economy of someone who has navigated obstacles before and doesn't have the luxury of panic. But the carpet in the hallway was thick and slightly uneven at the seams, the kind of surface that looked fine for foot traffic's sake, and was actually hell for a manual chair, and she was working harder than she should have had to. Claire, she turned. There was a half second where her face ran through several things: recognition, relief, the specific expression of someone who has been managing alone and is now recalibrating, and then she was professional again, controlled. The elevator locked, she said, still pushing. I know. West stairwell has an evacuation chair. They should all have one on each floor. He fell in beside her, matched her pace. Did you see anyone else in the hall? Room 412 had an elderly man. He was in the elevator when the alarm hit. It let him off and then locked. Where is he now? I sent him toward stairwell. East one. Mason glanced back down the hall. Empty. They reached the west stairwell. He pushed through first, held it, scanned the landing. No one above, no one below. The evacuation chair mounted on the wall in its yellow bracket, exactly where it was supposed to be. He'd used one once in a training exercise that he hadn't thought about in years. They were simple. Once you'd done it, fold-out sled straps, the rear wheels lifted, the whole chair tilting back to ride the stair edges in controlled descent. I'm going to transfer you to this, he said, already unhooking the evacuation chair from the wall. It'll be faster than I know what it is, she said. Performance about it. No embarrassment or protest. Just the direct practicality of someone who'd made peace with asking for help in the specific ways that her life now required it. He appreciated that more than he could have explained. The transfer took 40 seconds. She helped where she could, shifted her weight in the right directions, and when she was strapped in and he'd tilted the chair back onto its descent runners, he checked both straps once, with a quick double pull that was so ingrained it happened without thought. Ready, he said. I was ready 30 seconds ago, she said. He almost smiled. They went down. He had them out the west emergency exit and into the covered side alley that ran between the west ridge and the parking structure in under 3 minutes. The rain had gotten heavier while they'd been inside. It was coming down in that particular northwest way. Now, not vertical, but diagonal, driven by something off the coast that had opinions about direction. The alley was filling up with evacuated guests, a river of people in various states of dress and inconvenience streaming toward the perimeter. A hotel security guard was at the mouth of the alley, directing traffic. Portland Fire was already pulling up on the street. Mason could hear the truck and see the light strobing against the building faces. He got Claire clear of the bottleneck and stopped under the awning of the parking structure entrance, out of the mainstream of foot traffic. She was looking at the hotel. Was it real, she asked. No yet. She turned to look at him. Her hair was damp from the 20 feet of open air between the exit and the awning. She had the folder of printed forms to tuck and grab it somehow during all of it, which told him something about what those papers meant to her. Derek's truck was still out front, he said. Before the alarm. She held his gaze. So he didn't leave, she said. He went out the front door, and his truck didn't move. She was quiet for a moment, running the calculation he'd already run. The alarm, she said. I don't know, he said again. 'Cause he genuinely didn't. Hotels had false alarms. Kitchens had accidents. Guests did stupid things with candles and smoke detectors. He wasn't willing to say it out loud yet, that a deputy facing a misconduct complaint might have pulled a fire alarm to generate the specific chaos of mass evacuation, to put people in stairwells, and confuse the camera coverage and move a particular woman out of a locked hotel room and into a crowded, disorganized street was a stretch. It was also exactly what someone would do if they were smart about creating deniability. "You need to call someone," he said. "Not the department. A lawyer, an advocate, anyone who can Mason." He stopped. She was looking past him, toward the mouth of the alley. He turned. Derek Vance was standing at the corner of the building where the alley met the street, watching them with his hands in his jacket pockets and his face carrying the expression of a man who has found exactly what he was looking for. He wasn't running. He wasn't approaching. He was just standing there in the rain, watching, and the watching itself was the message. Mace positioned himself between Claire and Derek's sightline without making the movement obvious. He kept his posture neutral, his shoulders down, his hands visible. Everything about his body language said civilian bystander, not a challenge, not a threat, just a man standing under an awning in the rain. His mind was doing something else entirely. He was reading Derek the way he'd been trained to read people in uncertain situations, the specific assessment that happened below the level of deliberate thought, the calculation of distance and angle and intent and capability. Derek was across the alley, 30 feet, hands in pockets, right hand deeper than left, which was either dominant hand at rest or something else. Was wearing the gray jacket still. His weight was slightly forward on his right foot, which was either natural stance or pre-movement loading. Mason held all of this in the background and kept his face calm. Derek walked forward. Not fast, not aggressive. Walk of someone who owns time. He stopped 10 feet away. "Exciting morning," Derek said. "Seems like Mason said." Alarm went off. "Kitchen fire, they're saying." He glanced toward the hotel, then back. "Happen to know anything about that?" "I was in the lobby. With Ms. Donovan." He looked past Mason. "Ms. Donovan, how are you?" "I'm fine," Claire said from behind Mason. "Good." Derek nodded, as though she'd said something genuinely pleasant. He focused back on Mason with the slow, deliberate attention of someone who has decided to stop pretending. "What I've been thinking about since Monday? I'm sure you'll tell me. I've been thinking about the kind of man who inserts himself into other people's business." He took another step. 9 feet now. Specifically, the kind of man who does it in a way that's just careful enough to stay technically legal. Exactly where the line is. His eyes moved over Mason with the specific focus of reassessment. "That's a particular skill set. Or just common sense," Mason said. Derek shook his head. Common sense would have walked away Monday. Common sense doesn't come back 3 days later. He tilted his head. "What'd you do before Portland?" The question dropped into the space between them. "Contractor work," Mason said. Derek looked at him for a long moment. "What kind?" "The kind that doesn't make for interesting conversation." Derek smiled, not the manufactured lobby smile, but something narrower, something that had decided it was done with performance. "Here's where we are," Derek said. "I've got a complaint against me that's going to get reviewed and go nowhere, because that's what happens. You're a guy keeps showing up places. He wasn't invited, interfering with a law enforcement officer, which is actually a chargeable offense regardless of whether I was on duty. I want you to know I've already discussed that with the DA's office." He paused to let that land. "I'm offering you a way out. Walk away. Don't come back to this hotel. Stop playing hero for someone who is going to lose this fight regardless." Silence. The rain was picking up. "And Claire?" Mason said. "Ms. Donovan and I will have a conversation." "No," Mason said. "Excuse me?" "She's not having a conversation with you without counsel present, and you're not coming closer to her." Derek's jaw shifted. The pleasant mask was gone now. The entire performance of it, the relaxed hands, the conversational tone, the patient, reasonable facade of a man who had options. What was underneath it wasn't rage exactly. It was the cold, specific anger of someone who has not been told no very often and has forgotten how to process it. "You're making," Derek said very quietly, "a genuinely serious mistake." "You said that Monday," Mason said. "I'm still here." Something crossed Derek's face. A decision, arriving and landing. He stepped forward, and then he swung. It wasn't a telegraphed swing. That was the thing Mason would think about later. Derek hadn't been posturing. He'd been loading, and the step forward had been the final load, and the swing came from the shoulder with the weight behind it of someone who knew what he was doing and had done it before in situations where being precise about it mattered. Mason moved left. Not backward left, off the center line, the slip that every CQB instructor beats into every student in the first week, because moving backward is always wrong. Backward narrows your options. Backward is where people go when they're reacting instead of responding. The swings passed through the space where his head had been. Derek's momentum carried him forward, and Mason's right hand came up and caught his elbow, not gripping, redirecting the simple physics of taking someone's committed force and adding a vector to it that they didn't account for. Derek stumbled 2 steps to the right and hit the parking structure wall with his shoulder. He was good. Mason had to give him that. He recovered faster than most people would have pivoted, reset his footing, came back around already building the next movement. Mason didn't wait for it. He stepped into Derek's space, closer than Derek expected, inside the distance where a punch loses most of its power, and got his forearm across Derek's chest and drove him back against the wall again. Not hard enough to injure, hard enough to pin. Derek grabbed his jacket. Mason broke the grip, stepped back, adjusted his angle. "Stop," Mason said. Derek came again, faster this time, leading with his left a feint, setting up the right cross that followed half a second behind it. Decent combination. The feint was convincing. Mason took the feint at face value and slipped the right anyway, catching Derek's wrist as it came past and turning with it, the lock coming from below, leveraging the joint to its natural limit without going past it. Derek made a sound that was part pain and part fury. "Stop," Mason said again. Same tone, not louder. Derek threw his weight backward, trying to create space to reverse the lock. Mason let him move, released, reset. Somewhere in the evacuation crowd, at the mouth of the alley, someone was shouting something. He couldn't parse the words. He was narrowed down to the immediate space Derek's feet, his center of gravity, the angle of his shoulders, the way his breathing was coming in short, furious bursts now. Derek feinted right this time, full commitment, and then drove forward with his whole body weight, not a punch, a tackle, trying to use mass to settle what technique hadn't. Mason sidestepped, just barely. Yes, had cleaned, less clean than the first time he caught a shoulder check across his ribs that was going to feel significant tomorrow, and his back foot slipped on the wet pavement, and he had to grab the parking structure wall to keep from going down. Derek used the split second to reset and come around again. They were circling now, both breathing harder, the rain coming down between them, and Mason was aware in the part of his mind that never stopped running assessment of several things simultaneously, that this had gone further than it should have, that there were witnesses accumulating at the mouth of the alley, that someone had definitely called 911 by now, that Derek was not going to stop until Mason either gave ground or ended it, and that the only version of ending it that didn't involve significant injury was the one where he closed the distance and took the fight to the ground in a controlled way before Derek landed something that made control harder. He also knew that Ellie's school day ended at 3. That was the thing about having someone who needed him to come home. It changed the acceptable risk calculation in a very specific way. Derek committed again, right hand loaded. Mason didn't slip it this time. He moved into it, took the punch on his forearm in a block that sent a jolt up to his shoulder, and then he was inside Derek's guard, and he got his left hand to Derek's jacket collar, and his right arm around Derek's extended arm, and he pivoted, using Derek's own momentum, and Derek went to one knee on the wet pavement. Mason brought Derek's arm up and back into a control hold, not breaking, nowhere close to breaking, just the locked position where the only comfortable option is to stop moving. Derek tried to push up. Mason added 2 pounds of pressure. Derek stopped. Both of them were breathing hard. The rain was loud against the pavement and the parking structure roof and the back of Mason's neck. His ribs were telling him things about that shoulder check. His hands were wet. "Enough," Mason said. His voice came out level. He hadn't planned it, but it came out level. Derek was on his knee on the wet concrete with Mason's control hold on his arm and 6 feet of alley between them and the watching crowd. His face, turned partially to the side, was carrying an expression that Mason recognized from certain specific moments, in certain specific places, the expression of a man who has just discovered that the gap between what he thought he was capable of and what he actually is capable of is larger than he'd understood. For approximately 8 seconds, nobody moved. Then hotel security arrived from both ends of the alley at once. 3 of them. The lead one was a big man, early 40s, moving with the controlled urgency of someone who'd done crowd management before. He stopped 6 feet away and assessed the tableau in front of him: Mason, Derek on the pavement, the hold, the crowd, the rain, with the experienced eye of someone whose job required rapid threat classification. "Release him and step back." Mason looked at him. "I'll release him when you've got him," Mason said. The security manager looked at Derek, back at Mason. Some evaluation ran across his face. "Harris," he said to one of the 2 men behind him. "Come around left." Harris moved. When he was in position beside Derek, Mason released the hold and stepped back in one movement, immediately putting distance between himself and Derek, immediately making his hands visible, the posture of someone who has done what needed to be done and is now making it clear he's finished. Derek got to his feet. His knee was wet. His jaw was set in a hard line. He looked at Mason with eyes that were doing several things at once: recalibrating, cataloging, deciding. Harris and the other security officer were on Derek's flanks, without quite touching him. A third security team member had his radio up and was speaking into it in a low, fast voice. The security manager stepped toward Mason. He was looking at him, not the way people look at someone who's been in a fight, but the way people look at someone they're trying to place. "You're a guest of the hotel?" "I'm in the lobby on the day pass," Mason said. "The cafe. Can I get your name?" "Mason Rourke." The manager's expression shifted, just slightly. An adjustment, some neural connection completing itself. "Rourke," he repeated. "Yes." The manager looked at him for another moment. His radio crackled. He answered it briefly, then looked back at Mason. "Former military," he said. It wasn't quite a question. Mason held his gaze. The manager's radio crackled again. He stepped away to answer it, and Mason used the moment to look past him at Derek. Derek was watching Mason, with the wet pavement still dark on his knee and Harris standing 3 feet to his left. And whatever he'd expected from this morning, from all of it, from the text message and the fire alarm and the alley, the specific expression on his face, now said he had not expected this. He was looking at Mason the way you look at something you thought you'd assessed correctly, and have just realized you hadn't assessed at all. The security manager came back. He said, "Mr. Rourke, the lobby cameras, the hallway cameras, the alley camera." He tilted his head slightly toward the corner of the parking structure where a camera housing was mounted under an overhang. "We have everything." Mason said nothing. Deputy Vance, the manager, turned to face Derek. His voice had changed, not aggressive, just different in the way that authority sounds different when it has evidence behind it. "We're going to need you to come with us." Derek looked at Mason one more time. Mason looked back. Then Derek looked at the camera on the parking structure. And for the first time since Monday, something behind his eyes went out. Claire had stayed exactly where Mason had left her, under the awning, the folder still tucked under her arm. She'd watched all of it, he knew that without looking, had known it while it was happening. That specific awareness of being seen that sits at the edge of focused attention. When he walked back toward her, she looked at his face first, his hands, his face again. It was the assessment of someone checking for injury without wanting to perform concern. "Ribs," she said. "I'm fine. That's not what I asked." "I'll be sore tomorrow," he said. "I've been sorer." She nodded. Her hands were in her lap still, the controlled stillness she used when she was processing something significant. "The security manager knew your name," she said. Mason watched a Portland fire truck pulling back from the hotel entrance across the street. False alarm, apparently. Or contained. He didn't know yet. He recognized it, he said. "From what?" He looked at her. "From a long time ago," he said. She held his gaze for a long time. The rain was still coming down outside the awning, the diagonal northwest rain, with its opinions about direction. And the street was full of guests, filtering back toward the hotel entrance and security personnel and 2 Portland PD cruisers that had arrived sometime in the last 10 minutes. "Mason," she said. "Yeah, who are you actually?" He looked at the street, at the cruisers, at the hotel entrance where Derek was being walked by 2 security personnel and 1 uniformed officer, his silver truck still sitting in the loading zone, with rain on its roof, going nowhere now. He thought about how to answer. He thought about what his SEAL instructor would have said, about this moment, about the gap between what you show people and what you are, about whether that gap is protection or just another kind of distance you keep to avoid having to be known. He thought about Ellie, asking him whether he was scared. He thought about what he'd told her. Maybe a little. Doesn't mean you don't do something anyway. He turned back to Claire. Someone who spent a long time learning how to do dangerous things, he said, and a longer time trying to figure out what to do with that when the danger was over. He paused. I'm still working on the second part. She looked at him with those dry, careful eyes that seen too much in the last week to be surprised by much of anything. Navy, she said. He said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. She nodded slowly. Something settled in her expression, not the wide-eyed reaction he sometimes got, the cinematic version of being impressed, but something quieter and more real. The specific look of someone who has just understood why a thing happened the way it did and is filing it under makes sense now, rather than I can't believe it. The folder, she said after a moment. He looked at the papers in her lap. I got the forms notarized this morning, she said, before the alarm. The business center has a notary service. She looked at the folder, then at the hotel, then back at him. I'm going to file them today. He said, good. She said, walk me back in. He looked at the hotel entrance. The cruisers, the security personnel, the long glass windows of the Westbridge lobby, which caught the gray November light and gave it back as something slightly warmer than it actually was. Yeah, he said. They went back in together, and when the lobby doors closed behind them, the sound of the rain disappeared. And for a moment, the only thing Mason could hear was the ambient murmur of people who had come back inside and were reconstructing their morning. The low collective sound of an ordinary day trying to reassemble itself around an extraordinary interruption. He stood in the lobby with his damp jacket and his sore ribs and his hands, which had stopped shaking roughly 3 minutes ago, and he thought about his daughter building a model of the solar system in a classroom on the other side of the city. Thought about what she was going to ask him at dinner. He thought about what he was going to say. The lobby felt different when they walked back in. Maybe it was Mason, who felt different. He couldn't cleanly separate those two things. The ambient murmur of the Westbridge had resumed its ordinary register. Guests filing back through the revolving door, staff restoring the composed choreography that a luxury hotel requires of itself, regardless of what has just happened outside. But there was a residue in the air, the specific atmospheric quality of a space where something had recently been decided, where the social order had briefly exposed its underside and was now working to cover it back up. The security manager was waiting near the reception desk. His name tag said Harlan. He was the kind of man who'd been doing physical security work long enough that the professional calm was no longer performed, it had simply become how he existed. Yes, he watched Mason cross the lobby toward him with the patient attentiveness of someone who has questions that need answering before anything else moves forward. Mr. Rourke, he said, I need about 15 minutes of your time. Sure, Mason said. He looked back at Claire. She gave him a slight nod. She was fine. She had the folder. She knew what she was doing. He followed Harlan through a door behind the reception desk that led to a short corridor, and then a security office about the size of a walk-in closet. No, lined on one wall with monitors showing feeds from a dozen camera positions throughout the hotel. There was another man in the office already, younger than Harlan, early 30s, in a suit rather than a security uniform. He was sitting in a chair with a legal pad on his knee and a pen in his hand that suggested he was going to use it. This is Mr. Calloway, Harlan said. Hotel legal. Mason sat down in the offered chair. I want to be straightforward with you, Harlan said, settling into his own chair across from the monitors. We're not treating you as the problem here. But we need to understand what happened out there before the police want to talk to you, and they will want to talk to you. Okay, Mason said. Walk me through it. He did. He was concise and chronological, the way he'd been trained to give incident reports, which was without emotional editorializing, without justification, just sequenced fact. Derek appeared. Derek approached Claire. Derek swung first. Mason defended the hold. Security arrived. Calloway wrote things down. Harlan watched Mason's face while he talked. When he finished, Harlan said, You said he swung first. The alley camera will confirm that. I know. Harlan studied him. You sound very confident about that. Because I know what happened, Mason said. And I know what cameras are for. Calloway looked up from his legal pad. Mr. Fork, were you injured? Bruised ribs. Nothing requiring treatment. We'd like you to see the hotel physician anyway. For documentation purposes. Mason understood what he was actually being told. We're building a record, and your injuries are part of it. All right, he said. Harlan reached over and pulled up a camera feed on one of the monitors. He turned the screen slightly, so Mason could see at the alley angle, timestamp in the corner, the image frozen at the moment before Derek swung. The quality was better than Mason had expected. The outdoor camera was housing a lens that had been designed for exact this kind of low-light, high-movement situation. You could see Derek's right shoulder load. You could see Mason's head move left before the swing completed. You could see all of it in the specific, unambiguous visual grammar of evidence. This footage is going to 3 places today, Harlan said. The Portland Police Bureau, the County Sheriff's Internal Affairs Office, and our own legal department. That last one is because Deputy Vance pulled that fire alarm. Mason looked at him. We confirmed it 12 minutes ago, Harlan said. West Wing, 2nd floor, manual pull station. He went up the stairs during the evacuation. We have him on camera at the pull station, and we have him coming back down. He paused. That's criminal mischief at minimum. Potentially obstruction, depending on how the DA wants to frame it. Mason was quiet for a moment. He did it to move her, Mason said. A question. That's what the sequence of events suggests, yes. He wanted to get her out of a hotel room she could lock and into a stairwell. Yes, Harlan said. Has anyone told her that? Not yet. We wanted to speak with you first. Mason looked at the frozen camera image on the monitor. Derek's shoulder loaded. The geometry of a decision already made. She needs to know, Mason. Anne said. She needs to know today before she files those forms and he finds out she filed them. That's being handled, Calloway said from his corner. Portland police arrived at 11:47. 2 uniformed officers first. Detective intervened. Then a detective named Brassard, who introduced herself in the hotel's conference room with the specific efficiency of someone who has a lot of other things on her schedule today and is managing her time accordingly. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, compact, with the kind of direct eye contact that professional interviewers develop, not aggressive, just occupying. Mason sat across from her at the conference table. Harlan was to his left. Calloway, Mason noted, had positioned himself near the door without sitting, the standing room posture of someone who wants to be able to interject but is technically observing. Brassard put a digital recorder on the table and told Mason what it was and that she was recording. Walk me through Monday evening first, she said. He did. Same way he'd done it for Harlan, concise, sequential, no editorializing. He didn't make Derek sound like a monster. He described what he'd seen and what he'd done. Brassard wrote in a notebook, even though the recorder was running. She asked clarifying questions in the flat, competent way of someone who already knows most of the answers and is checking his version against a matrix. You positioned yourself between the deputy and Ms. Donovan, she said. Was that a deliberate choice? Yes. Had you received training in de-escalation or conflict management? Some, Mason said. Brassard looked at some. She wrote something. What was your service branch? He hadn't mentioned the military. He looked at her. Mr. Harlan identified you from a press mention. 3 years ago, she said. Search and rescue operation north of Hood River. The article mentioned prior service. Navy, he said. And your rate? He held her gaze for 2 seconds. Special warfare operator, he said. She wrote it down without reacting, which he respected. So when you say you received some training in conflict management, she said, that's extensive training, he said. I was understating. Habit. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, okay, Thursday morning, the hallway. He walked her through Thursday too, the hallway confrontation, the lobby cafe. Derek leaving through the front door with his truck still parked outside. He told her about the anonymous text message. He unlocked his phone and showed it to her, and she photographed it with her own phone. You kept the message, she said. Yes, because you thought you might need it. Most civilians would have deleted it or ignored it, she said. He said she studied him. You came back to this hotel because you thought he'd make a move against Miss Donovan. I came back because I thought it was possible. A distinction. Yes. But you didn't call us, she said, before coming here today. He looked at the table for a moment, then back at her. I thought about it, he said. I thought about the fact that the text was anonymous and didn't specifically threaten anyone, and you'd have no grounds to do anything with it. He paused. And I thought about the fact that Derek Vance is a deputy, and I'm a civilian with no official standing, and the math on how seriously that call would be taken didn't work out the way I wanted it to. That's a fair assessment of how it might have gone, Brassard said. Neutral tone. Not admitting anything, not denying it either. Mason said. She tapped her pen against her notebook. The confrontation in the alley. You restrained him. Using what method? Joint control hold. Right arm. I was trying to stop the situation without causing injury. Were you successful? He's going to have some soreness in his shoulder, Mason said. That's from the pavement, not the hold. Brassard looked at him. Something in her expression had been shifting, incrementally, throughout the interview, not softening exactly, but adjusting. He'd intervened. The recalibration of a professional who had come in expecting one kind of conversation and was having a different one. Mr. Rourke, she said, I'm going to be direct with you. Please, what happened in that alley is complicated from a legal standpoint, regardless of who swung first. A former Navy SEAL uses a control technique on an off-duty law enforcement officer that's going to generate paperwork and review, regardless of the footage. I understand. The footage helps you significantly. The fire alarm confirmation helps you significantly. The text message helps you. She set her pen down. But I want to know, is there anything about this situation that you're not telling me because you think it makes you look bad? He looked at her. I went to that hotel today because I was worried about what Derek Vance would do to Claire Donovan if no one was there, he said. Was right to be worried. That's the part of it that I'd do differently. If I was trying to look like I made a perfectly defensible decision, I'd stay home. But I didn't. He paused. I had a daughter to pick up at 3 o'clock and I went anyway. That's either character or stupidity. Probably both. Brassard looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her pen. Okay, she said. The interview took 90 minutes total. When it was done, Brassard told him he was not being detained, that his presence might be requested as a witness in subsequent proceedings, and that he should preserve the text message and make himself available. She shook his hand with the direct, brief grip of someone who has formed an opinion and is keeping it professional. He found Claire in the lobby cafe, the same table where he'd had his cold coffee that morning, which felt like it had been 4 days ago, rather than 4 hours. She had a cup of tea in front of her, and her phone in her hand, and she was not doing the thing people do when they're on their phones to pass time. She was working, her eyes moving across the screen with focused attention, her thumb scrolling in precise increments. She looked up when he sat down. Internal Affairs, he said. They called 20 minutes ago, she said. They want a formal recorded statement. She set the phone down. Detective Brassard's office called before that. And the hotel legal department told me about the fire alarm. How are you? She thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. Angry, she said. At a level I'm choosing not to perform for you right now. You don't have to perform anything, I know. She'd picked up her tea. He pulled a fire alarm to get me into a stairwell. He planned that. That she stopped. Started again. I've had people be dismissive. I've had people be rude. I've had someone tell me, in a professional context, that my accessibility needs were inconvenient for the team's workflow. She looked at the table. That's a different category than this. Mason said nothing. She wasn't asking for a response. She was processing out loud, and the best thing he could offer was to let her. He thought I was alone, she said. He thought I was grieving and alone and I didn't have anyone, and I wouldn't have a witness. She looked up. He was almost right, but he wasn't. Because you came back. She held his gaze. Why did you come back, Mason? Actually, not the version where you were just in the neighborhood. He looked at his hands on the table. His knuckles were slightly abraded from the alley. Not badly, just the surface friction of wet concrete. Noticed during the interviews. He noticed now. Because I know what it looks like when someone decides that rules don't apply to them, he said. I've been in environments where that's the whole operating philosophy. And I know what happens to the people those environments designate as not worth protecting. He paused. And I have a daughter. And she was watching on Monday. Claire was quiet. And she said, She'd heard the incomplete sentence the way a good listener hears them. I've spent 3 years telling myself the part of me that knows how to deal with situations like that was something I left behind. He looked up. Turns out you can't leave it behind. You can just decide what you do with it. She held his gaze for a long time. Does it bother you? She said. What happened in the alley? He thought about being honest versus being reassuring. He chose honest. The hitting doesn't bother me, he said. I've hit people for worse reasons. What bothers me is that I liked knowing I still could. He said it straight. That's something I'm still figuring out what to do with. She nodded. No flinching, of reassurance, no rush to make him feel better about it. She just held it the way you hold something that deserves to be held, without immediately being resolved. Thank you, she said finally, for being honest. You asked an honest question. Most people don't answer them. He almost said something about how that had been true for him too for a long time, and then decided that was enough honesty for one morning, and drank the coffee the cafe staff had brought him sometime in the last 10 minutes without him noticing. The filing happened at 2:15 p.m. Claire submitted the notarized forms to the county's Law Enforcement Oversight Board via the hotel's business center, fax, and then electronically through the board's online portal, and then sent physical copies by certified mail from the hotel's concierge desk. 3 redundant methods, because redundancy was something Mason had recommended without quite realizing he was recommending it. And she'd looked at him when he said it and said, "You think like someone who plans for things going wrong." And he'd said yes, and she'd said, "Good," and done all 3. While she was at the concierge desk, Mason called the search and rescue coordinator he'd been working with, a woman named Petra, who ran the civilian team out of a facility near Troutdale and had a professional manner that reminded him of his business team leaders, by which he meant she gave clear directives and didn't waste words. "You were supposed to be here at 1, Petra said when she answered. "I'm sorry, something came up. Are you hurt?" He paused. "Bruised ribs. I'll be there Friday." "What happened?" "Long story. Is the team running the Orient exercise today?" "We pushed it to tomorrow because Delgado pulled his hamstring." "Are you going to tell me what happened?" "Friday," he said. She made a sound that was professionally skeptical. "Mason," she said, "I've been pushing the board to bring you on formally, as a consultant, full training coordinator." She paused. "I need to know you're not going to create situations that make that complicated." He looked across the lobby at Claire, who was handing the concierge the stack of certified mail envelopes with the focused care of someone documenting each step. "I didn't create this situation," he said. "That's not entirely what I asked," he said, "but it's the true part." Petra was quiet for a moment. "Friday," she said, 8 a.m. Bring your paperwork current. I'm filing the formal proposal Monday." She hung up. He stood with his phone for a moment. The formal proposal. He'd known it was coming. She'd been building toward it for 2 months. Incrementally, competent people build toward things, testing each component before assembling the whole. Training coordinator for a civilian search and rescue organization was not what he'd imagined doing with the skill set the Navy had built in him over 11 years. It was also, he was increasingly aware, exactly the right container for it. The skills transferred navigation, triage, team movement in uncertain terrain, the systematic management of high-stress situations where someone's survival depends on the people around them keeping their heads. He could do that. He was good at that. And it was the kind of thing you could do while picking your daughter up at 3 o'clock. He put the phone in his pocket and went to help with the mail. The call came at 4:47 p.m. Mason was at Ellie's school by then, sitting in the pickup line with the engine running, and the radio on something that was playing a song he didn't know but didn't change. Ellie was visible through the glass doors of the school's main entrance. He could see her yellow jacket with the fixed zipper, her planet and dinosaur backpack, her dark hair. She was talking to her friend Priya, who was apparently real and not mythological. His phone rang. Unknown number, but a Portland area code. He answered Mr. Rourke. Male voice, professional. Careful in the way that people are careful when they're about to say something with legal implications. "This is Lieutenant Gerald Watt. I'm the Deputy Commander for Professional Standards at the Multnomah County Sheriff's Office." Mason watched Ellie through the glass. "Okay," he said. "We've received the complaint filed today by Ms. Claire Donovan. And we've been notified by the Portland Police Bureau of the incident at the Westbridge Hotel this morning. We've also received and reviewed the hotel's camera footage. A pause. Deputy Vance has been placed on administrative leave effective 2 hours ago, pending a formal review. All right, Mason said. I want to be clear that this call is informal and is not a formal notification of any kind. Another pause, slightly longer. I also want to tell you, off the record, that we've begun a preliminary review of Deputy Vance's prior conduct, and we're seeing a pattern in the complaints that warrants significant attention. Mason said nothing. We're going to want Ms. Donovan to be available for a formal interview in the next week, Watt said. And we may want a statement from you as well, beyond what you've already provided to Detective Brassard. She'll be available, Mason said. I'll make sure she knows. Watt cleared his throat. Mr. Rourke, the footage from the alley. You handled a volatile situation with a trained law enforcement officer without. He stopped, recalibrated. The review is going to note your restraint. Mason looked at his hand on the steering wheel, the abraded knuckles. I had a reason to be restrained, he said. Your daughter, Watt said. A question. Yes, I have 2 kids myself, Watt said. Was the first human thing he'd said in the whole conversation, the first sentence that wasn't wrapped in professional language and legal caution. It landed differently because of it. The school doors opened. Ellie came out at a run, said something to Priya over her shoulder, hit the crosswalk at full 6-year-old velocity, and reached the car before Mason had fully processed that he needed to unlock it. Thank you for the call, Lieutenant, Mason said. Take care of yourself, Watt said. He hung up as Ellie pulled the door open and threw herself into the back seat with the backpack and the specific energy of a child who has been compressed into a classroom for 6 hours and has reached pressure capacity. Okay, the solar system thing. She was already pulling her backpack off. Ms. Alvarez said we can use string to show the actual distances, and I need like 50 feet of string. Do we have string? And also, Priya said Pluto doesn't deserve to be a planet because it's too small. But that's not fair because size shouldn't determine your worth, and I told her that. And she said I was being weird about a rock, and I said she was. She stopped. He'd turned around in the seat to look at her. She had her planet and dinosaur backpack, half open, in her lap, and her yellow jacket was slightly askew, and her hair had partially escaped whatever had been holding it this morning. What? She said. How was school? She gave him the look. The one that said she'd been in the middle of something important. Fine, she said. How was your day? He thought about the alley, about Derek's shoulder loading, about Brassard's recorder on the conference table, about Claire's hands still in her lap, about Lieutenant Watt's voice saying your daughter like he already knew. Fine, Mason said. She looked at him with those eyes that always saw more than he was comfortable with. You have a bruise on your hand, she said. He looked at the knuckles. He'd forgotten to cover them. I bumped it, he said. She stared at it. Bumped it on what? A wall, she stared at him. We'll get string on the way home, he said. 50 feet should be enough for the inner planets. We might need more for Neptune. Another long look. Then she accepted the redirect the way she sometimes accepted redirects. Not because she'd stopped wondering, but because she'd filed it under Ask Later and moved on. Can we get the good string? Not the thin kind, sure. And can we get the Parmesan? We're out. We're not out. There's a whole container. There's not enough. It's a full container. Dad, I need you to trust me on the Parmesan. He turned back to the road and pulled out of the pickup line. Okay, he said. We'll get Parmesan. She started talking about Neptune again. He listened and drove and watched the Portland street lamps begin to come on in the early dark of November. And somewhere across the city, Derek Vance was sitting at home or in a precinct waiting room or wherever men go when the badge they've been hiding behind finally gets taken off the table, and the camera footage was being reviewed. As soon as he'd intervened, and the certified mail was in transit, and the formal review was already beginning to dismantle the pattern that had protected him for longer than anyone should have let it go. And Mason drove home through the amber Portland night with his daughter telling him about string and Neptune and the injustice of Pluto, and his ribs ached quietly from the alley. And he thought about what Petra had said about the formal proposal, and he thought about a conversation with Claire that had been more honest than most conversations he'd managed in 3 years. And he thought about all the things he'd been telling himself about who he was now versus who he'd been, and which parts of that story were true, and which parts were just easier to believe than the alternative. He wasn't sure yet, but he was closer to sure than he'd been on Monday. Felt like something. He pulled up to the hardware store for string. Ellie was out of the car before he'd finished parking, already heading for the entrance with the focused energy of a child on a mission, and he locked the car and followed her, and the rain had stopped for the first time in days, and the sky above Portland was doing something complicated and briefly beautiful in the last of the light. He didn't notice it for long. Ellie was already inside. The string turned out to be the wrong kind anyway. Ellie discovered this approximately four minutes after they got home, when she unrolled 6 feet of it across the kitchen floor and decided it was too shiny and therefore scientifically inaccurate, a determination she delivered with the absolute conviction of someone who had clearly given the matter serious thought during the car ride and was only now sharing her conclusions. Mason stood in the kitchen doorway with the full spool of hardware store string and looked at his daughter, who was on her hands and knees examining the shiny string with the critical attention of a NASA engineer reviewing payload specifications. "It's string, Elle. It's the wrong string. What makes string wrong?" She looked up at him, with the expression that meant he'd asked a question she considered too obvious to require a full answer. "It's shiny," she said. "Space isn't shiny." He looked at the string. He looked at her. He set the spool on the counter and started on dinner. She used the shiny string anyway. By 8 o'clock, the living room floor was covered in a solar system, rendered in hardware store twine and index cards labeled in her handwriting, with Neptune at one end of the room and a crumpled sun representation, a yellow balloon she'd found in a kitchen drawer from some birthday 6 months ago tacked to the far wall. She had consulted her library book on planetary distances 4 times and recalculated twice, after determining that her initial measurements had been approximately correct, but not exactly correct, which is different. He sat on the couch and watched her work. She'd asked him once, about an hour in, whether he thought the model was good. He'd said yes. She'd said, "You're not looking at it." He'd said, "Elle, I'm looking right at it." She'd said, "You're looking at it, but you're not seeing it. There's a difference." He'd looked at her then, really looked. And he'd said, "Neptune looks exactly right." And she'd gone back to measuring with the expression of someone who had accepted a compliment, but wasn't going to distract from the work by it. She was, he thought, going to be something remarkable. Whatever form that took, in whatever direction it went, remarkable was already visible, already present, already operating at full capacity in this kitchen drawer balloon. Hardware store string vision of the cosmos spread across his living room floor. He sat with his sore ribs and his cold coffee and watched her measure the distance to Uranus. At 9:15, he carried her to bed, which she was technically too old for, but submitted to without protest, because she was also, under the remarkable thing, still 6. 6-year-olds who have been measuring the solar system for 2 hours in a way that makes arguments feel like too much work. He pulled the blanket up. She was already half gone, the rabbit under her arm, her hair spread across the pillow. "Dad," she said, eyes still closed. "Yeah. Are we going back to that hotel?" He'd been expecting something like this since the pickup line. The question had been forming all afternoon. He could feel it approaching the way you feel weather approaching. The atmospheric shift before the actual arrival. "Probably," he said. "Because of that lady? Claire?" "Partly." She processed this behind her closed eyes. "Is she okay?" Ellie asked. "She's going to be," he said. Same answer as Monday. He meant it more now. "And the man?" Her voice was fading. "The one who left." "He's being dealt with," Mason said. "By the right people." Silence for a moment. "Good," she said. Then she was asleep. He stood in the doorway for a while. The hallway was quiet. Outside, Portland had resumed its default condition: rain, amber light, the distant suggestion of traffic. The solar system was still spread across the living room floor. He was going to have to step over Mercury to get to the kitchen. He didn't mind. 3 weeks passed. The formal review of Derek Vance's conduct was not a fast process institutional accountability rarely is, which is both its weakness and, occasionally, the thing that makes it stick. But it moved, which was more than most people who'd filed complaints against him over the years had seen. Westbridge Hotel footage was entered as evidence. The alley camera was entered as evidence. The fire alarm pull station footage was entered as evidence, And this one carried particular weight because it was the piece that converted the story from a he-said-said disagreement about professional conduct into something documentary and inarguable. A sworn law enforcement officer had pulled a hotel fire alarm as a deliberate act of interference. That was on tape. That didn't disappear into the interpretive space where his previous complaints had gone to die. The anonymous text message was traced. It took longer than Mason had expected and involved a subpoena to the carrier, which told him that someone in the DA's office had decided to be thorough. The number resolved to a prepaid phone purchased at a gas station in southeast Portland 2 days after the Monday lobby incident. The purchase was caught on the gas station's camera. The man on the camera was Derek Vance. That piece of information arrived via Brassard on a Tuesday afternoon. She called Mason directly, which she didn't have to do but did, with the same efficient brevity of their first conversation. She told him the trace result and told him it was being added to the formal record. No. And told him he might want to inform Ms. Donovan. He told Claire that evening. They'd gotten into the habit of brief calls, not long conversations, not the confessional depth of the Westbridge Cafe, just the practical exchange of people who were navigating a shared situation and found it easier to navigate it together. She listened to the trace result without interrupting. Of course, she said when he'd finished. Does that surprise you? Clarifies. She paused. It means he started planning the harassment before I even filed the formal complaint. He pulled that alarm and sent that text as preemptive intimidation. Mason said. That's going to matter, she said. In the review. Brassard thinks so. Another pause. How are your ribs? He'd forgotten she knew about his ribs. He tested them with a careful breath, still slightly tender along the left side, but the bruising had peaked and was fading now. 3 weeks out from an impact like that was usually the window where things stopped being a daily reminder and became an occasional one. He said. Good, she said. And then the board wants me at a formal hearing on the 22nd. Will you come? Yes, he said, without deliberating. She didn't say thank you, which he appreciated. She said 7:30, before the hearing, which meant she wanted to meet first, over the sequence, be prepared, professional. He appreciated that too. The hearing was in a county building, on the east side a conference room, with institutional carpet and too many chairs arranged around a table that was slightly too large for the space. The board consisted of 5 people, 2 county administrators, retired judge, a community liaison, a law enforcement representative from a municipality who'd been brought in specifically to avoid the appearance of internal conflict management. Claire testified for 40 minutes. Mason sat in the row of chairs along the wall and watched her work. She was not emotional. That was the first thing he noticed, not in the sense of being cold, but in the sense of being precise. She had prepared, and the preparation showed. She had dates. She had documentation. She had the notarized forms. She'd filed through 3 redundant channels, and she had the specific quality of someone who has been disbelieved before and has therefore learned to make themselves undeniable. She described Monday in the lobby. She described the wheelchair, the floor, the marble. She described the hallway on Thursday and Derek's specific language, the pauses on certain words, the deliberate framing, the people like you that he'd deployed like a scalpel. She described the fire alarm, the stairwell, what the alarm had interrupted. The board asked questions. Some of them were the questions people ask when they're skeptical, the careful conditional phrasing, no, that gives the asker room to retreat if the answer is inconvenient. Claire answered them the way. She answered everything, precisely, without defensive inflation, without minimization. One board member, the community liaison, a woman in her 60s who'd been taking careful notes throughout, said, Donovan, I want to ask you something that isn't strictly procedural. She paused. You came back to this hotel multiple times after the initial incident. Can you tell us why? Claire looked at her directly. Because not coming back would have meant he won before the review process even started, she said. He was counting on me being afraid of that lobby. I decided I wasn't going to be. A pause. My mother died the week this started. She spent a significant part of her life making herself smaller so other people would be more comfortable. I spent the time after her funeral thinking about whether I wanted to keep doing the same thing. She looked at the folder in her lap. I decided I didn't. The room was quiet. Mason looked at his hands. He testified after her, 30 minutes. Same sequence, same efficient structure. The board's questions for him had a different quality, slightly more guarded. The particular caution of people who are aware they're interviewing a former Navy SEAL who physically restrained the subject of the review and are not entirely sure how to categorize that. The retired judge asked him, "Mr. Rourke, in your assessment, why do you think Deputy Vance chose Ms. Donovan as a target?" Mason thought about the question seriously before he answered it. He chose her because he thought she was alone, he said. He thought she grieving and disabled and new to the city and didn't have anyone who would show up for her. He'd made an assessment of her vulnerability and he thought he was right. He paused. He was wrong about the alone part. He was also wrong about the vulnerable part, but that's a different conversation. The judge wrote something. "Was he wrong about the vulnerable part?" the judge said. "Because you were there?" Mason said. "He was wrong about it before I showed up. He just didn't know it yet." The formal findings came 8 days after the hearing. Derek Vance was terminated from the Multnomah County Sheriff's Office. The termination letter cited conduct unbecoming, deliberate misuse of law enforcement authority, criminal mischief relative to the fire alarm, and a pattern of behavior documented across 7 prior complaints that had been individually dismissed, but in aggregate constituted a systematic pattern the board determined could no longer be ignored. He also faced criminal charges. The fire alarm carried the high exposure. It was the piece that moved everything from administrative to criminal, and the DA's office had decided to pursue it. The anonymous harassment text was filed as a supporting charge. His attorney had already begun negotiations, which Brassard relayed to Mason with the neutral efficiency of someone conveying information without editorializing. Mason thought he heard something in her voice that wasn't quite satisfaction, but was in the vicinity of it. Mason heard the news in his truck, parked outside the search and rescue facility in Troutdale. He'd been full-time training coordinator for 11 days. The title had arrived with a modest salary and a set of responsibilities that were, as Petra had assessed, exactly the right container for a particular skill set that had needed a different context. He sat with the information for a moment. He thought about Derek's face in the alley, the recalibration, this discovery of the gap between what he'd thought he was and what he actually was. He didn't feel the specific satisfaction he'd expected to feel at this news. What he felt was more like the emotional equivalent of something returning to its correct position, a joint relocated, a structural problem corrected. Euphoric. Just right. He got out of the truck and went inside. He'd witnessed the robbery in the main training room. Petra was at the whiteboard in the main training room, drawing a grid search pattern for a group of 8 volunteers who were arranged in folding chairs with the slightly self-conscious attentiveness of adults in a classroom setting. She looked up when Mason came in. "Results?" she said. "Terminated," he said. "Criminal charges pending." She held his gaze for a moment. "Good," she said. Same word Claire used. The word people use is when something has landed where it was supposed to land. She turned back to the whiteboard. He took his position at the side of the room and looked at the 8 volunteers in their folding, a mix of ages, backgrounds, experience levels, people who had decided that helping was something they were willing to do with their limited free time. Retired nurse, 2 college students, a high school PE teacher, a middle-aged man who'd mentioned on his first day that his brother had been lost on a trail in the Cascades for 2 days before rescue teams found him, and he'd thought about joining a team ever since, but hadn't until now. Mason knew that feeling. The idea living in you for years until something makes it urgent. He picked up a red marker and started adding to Petra's grid. Claire called him on a Saturday morning in December. He was at the kitchen table with coffee and a personnel file. Petra had asked him to review one of the volunteers being considered for a team lead position. Ellie was at a friend's birthday party. The house had the particular quiet of a space that was usually occupied by a 6-year-old and wasn't at the moment, which was a different kind of quiet than actual silence. "The advocacy group wants me to present at their January conference," Claire said, "on documentation strategies for people who've experienced law enforcement misconduct." "That's good," Mason said. "They want a co-presenter, someone who can speak to the witness perspective." A pause. "I thought of you." He looked at the personnel file. Out the kitchen window, where the December rain was doing its committed diagonal thing against the glass. A conference, he said. In Portland. The convention center. January 14th. He stopped. Started again. Usually present. I know, she said. I'm asking anyway. He thought about the volunteers in their folding chairs. The retired nurse who'd taken notes on everything he said. The guy whose brother had been lost in the Cascades, who'd come in on day one, like someone who'd been waiting a long time to start. What would I be presenting on exactly? He said. The decision to intervene, she said. What it takes for someone to step forward when everyone else has decided not to. He was quiet. You don't have to talk about the military, she said. You don't have to talk about anything you're not comfortable with. But the people who are going to be in that room are mostly people who have been through something like what I went through, and a lot of them are still figuring out whether anyone is willing to show up for them. She paused. I thought it might mean something, coming from someone who did. He looked at the rain on the window. January 14th, he said. I'll need to move a training session. I know. Okay, he said. A small silence. How are you, he asked. Different question than usual, not the practical one. Not the case management one. She thought about it, with the seriousness she brought to things. Getting there, she said. Which is different from fine, but it's honest. Another pause. I've been thinking about my mother. Yeah? She would have told me to drop the complaint. Not from cowardice, she just didn't think it would go anywhere. She'd tried things like that before, in different contexts, and they hadn't. She was quiet for a moment. I keep thinking about what I'd tell her now, that it did go somewhere, that it mattered that we tried. Mason said, I think she'd know. Maybe, Claire said. Or maybe that's the story I need it to be. Both can be true, he said. She considered that. Yes, she said. They can. He picked Ellie up from the birthday party at 2 in the afternoon. She got in the car with cake on her sleeve and the detailed recap of events already, beginning before she'd fully closed the door. The party had involved a magician who had apparently failed to adequately conceal his methods, which Ellie had found disappointing, but also educational. I figured out the card trick, she announced. How? His sleeve. He kept touching his left sleeve, and then acting like he wasn't. And that's where the card was. Did you tell him? She gave him a look. Dad, that would be rude. I told Priya, she said after, also rude. Priya doesn't count. She's my best friend. He pulled out of the parking lot. The rain had briefly stopped, and December light was doing something tentative and low across the Portland rooftops, the kind of light that didn't commit to warmth, but at least acknowledged the concept. Dad, Ellie said, after they'd been driving for a few minutes. At that hotel, the lady in the wheelchair. He glanced in the rear view. He glanced. She was looking out her window with the sideways expression of someone thinking through something carefully. Claire, he said. Is she okay now? Like, actually okay? She's getting there, he said. Same words Claire had used. Ellie absorbed this. Did the man get in trouble? Real trouble? Or just like someone talked to him and that was it? He looked at his daughter in the rearview mirror. 6 years old with her cake-sleeved arm and her planet and dinosaur backpack, and her capacity for cutting directly to the question that mattered. Trouble, he said. He lost his job. He's facing charges. She nodded, processing. Good, she said. The word with weight behind it, not vindictive. Just the weight of a 6-year-old sense of fairness reasserting itself after it had been uncertain for a while. They drove in comfortable silence for a block. Then she said, Dad, I wasn't scared. That night, in the hotel, she said it carefully, like she was getting something exact. I was worried about you, but I wasn't scared. He looked in the rear view again. She was still watching the window, he said. No. She turned and looked at him in the mirror. 'Cause you went over there. When everyone else just stood there. He held her eyes in the mirror for a moment. I almost didn't, he said. Honest, the way he'd decided to be with her when it mattered. She looked at him with the specific expression she made when she was deciding whether to accept the answer or push further. But you did, she said. He turned onto their street. He said, I did. The Westbridge Hotel in January looked different than it had in November. The same marble floors, the same vaulted ceilings, the same elevator bank near the north wall. But January light through those tall lobby windows was different from November light, cleaner. colder, arriving at a lower angle that caught the marble and gave it back something that November never had. Warmth, exactly. More like clarity. Mason was in the lobby because Claire had asked him to meet her there, the morning of the advocacy conference. She'd said she wanted to walk through the lobby before they headed to the convention center. He'd understood what she meant, not logistics, but something deliberate, an intentional act of returning. He was 10 minutes early, which was habitual, and he used the time the way he used most waiting time quiet inventory. Check-in desk, 2 staff, 1 guest. Straight seating area, 3 business people, an elderly woman with a paperback. The business center hallway, quiet, carpeted, the doors closed. The elevator bank, empty. He looked at the spot near the elevator where Claire had been sitting the first time he'd seen her. Steet, the spot on the marble floor where the wheelchair had gone over. Just floor now. Smooth and cold and unremarkable, the way places are after the things that happened in them have passed through them. The elevator opened. Claire came out. She was in a dark blazer and gray pants. Her hair pulled back, the folder, a new one balanced on her lap. She was wearing a small pin on her lapel that he recognized as the logo of the advocacy organization. She looked, he thought, like someone who was about to walk into a room of people who needed to hear something true and had decided she was ready to tell it. She saw him and rolled toward him. "You're early," she said. "You're earlier," he said. "I wanted a minute in here first." She looked at the lobby, the windows, the light, the marble floor. She looked at it without flinching, without performing either comfort or discomfort. Just looking. "It's just a room," she said, not to him exactly, more to herself. "Yeah," he said. "I know that," she said. "I knew it before, but knowing it and feeling it are different." He said nothing. She looked at the spot near the elevator for a long moment. "He took something from me that night," she said. "Or he tried to. The way I felt about this room. About whether I was safe in places like this." She looked up at the windows. "I came back because I wasn't going to let him keep it." He thought about the lockbox in his closet. About 3 years of telling himself the dangerous part of himself needs to stay buried. About what his teammate had said on the phone. You took all that training and you decided you were done with it. Like it was a thing you could put in storage. "There are things you can't put in storage," he said. She said, "You can only decide what to do with them." He looked at her. She looked at him. Something passed between them, in the way that things pass between people who have been through something together and have come out the other side, changed in ways they're still mapping. "Ready," he said. She straightened the folder in her lap. "Yes," she said. They crossed the lobby together, him walking, her rolling, the morning light falling through the tall windows across the marble between them. A staff member near the desk nodded. The elevator bank passed on their left. The revolving door approached. He pushed through first and held it for her, the cold January air coming through. No, and they came out onto the street where Portland was doing its January thing, low sky, clean air, the specific stillness of a city that hasn't fully woken up yet on a Saturday morning. He thought about Ellie at home with her solar system still spread across the living room floor. She'd refused to disassemble it because she wasn't finished refining the measurements, which meant it was going to be there until approximately spring. He thought about Petra and the training schedule and the 8 volunteers in their folding chairs and the guy whose brother had been lost in the Cascades. He thought about his wife and the Tuesday afternoon that rearranged the world. He thought about that in the specific brief way he'd learned to think about it, acknowledging it, letting it be true, not making it smaller than it was, but also not letting it be bigger than what came after. He thought about a marble floor and a wheelchair and 46 people who'd found something else to look at, and one who hadn't. "Walk or cab," Claire said beside him on the sidewalk. He looked down the street. The convention center was 12 blocks. The sky was holding no rain yet, though it would come. "Walk," he said. She looked at the sidewalk, then at him. 12 blocks, she said. "I know." She looked at the street again. Then she started moving forward and he fell into step beside her, and they went down the sidewalk together into the January morning. The lobby doors closed behind them. Inside, the West Bridge continued its ordinary morning guests, checking in, staff moving, coffee being poured, the ambient murmur of a place that didn't know or care about the specific history of the marble near the elevator bank because marble doesn't remember, and rooms don't keep score, and the world moves forward regardless. But the people who had been in it, the ones who'd been on the floor, the ones who'd stood up, the ones who'd watched, and decided to keep watching until watching became something more, they carried it forward, in the only way things actually get carried, inside the choices they made the next time, and the time after that, and every ordinary Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday morning, when the question arrived again in whatever form it chose to take. It doesn't take armor to stand up. It doesn't take a badge or a title or a past that announces itself. It takes the decision made in the 3 seconds that nobody else is moving to be the one who moves. That decision belongs to anyone willing to make it.